I think it's important to understand how your bread machine works so that you can get the most use out of your bread machine, and it will be a valuable piece of equipment in your kitchen. Today I want to continue along with the series I'm doing on the different functions of the bread machine. The first video covered the number one function, the soft bread function. And in this video, I hope to cover the sweet bread function and the natural sourdough bread function. What we're going to learn in this video today is when is it appropriate to use that function and what is the difference in that function as opposed to the others. Let's jump into talking about the sweet bread function. And if you want to see the video on the number one soft bread function, you can click on the link here or here, I'm not sure where it'll put it, and watch that video, and I explain in detail about the soft bread function. So the sweet bread function, when you choose sweet bread on the KBS machine, it is function number 2. And I don't know what function number it might be on your machine, but it's probably in a similar order. So when you choose the sweet bread function, you get to choose the color of the crust, light, medium, or dark, and you get to choose the size of the loaf, whether it is a 1 pound, 1.5 pound, or a 2 pound loaf. And the only difference in the amount of time that the machine works is determined by the size of the loaf. It is not determined, at least on the KBS machine. I think it is different on, I know, the Bread Man and maybe some others, but on the KBS machine, it is only different length of baking time based on the size of the loaf. However, you can get a light, medium, or dark crust, and what I think the machine is doing when you choose that function, it changes the heat of the temperature of the machine, at least during the latter part of the cycle, and that gives you a darker crust. Personally, I have found that anything other than a light crust for a lot of the breads that I make kind of gives me a bread that is a little dry. It kind of dries it out. So I don't normally use the others unless I find that the particular bread I'm making doesn't get done enough on the light crust. I usually use light crust. But it will increase the baking time by 5 minutes. For example, if you have a 1 pound loaf and you choose light crust, well, like I said, it doesn't matter which color of crust you choose, at least on the KBS machine. A 1 pound loaf, the total working time is 2 hours, 54 minutes, and 25 seconds. A 1.5 pound loaf, the total working time is 2 hours, 59 minutes, and 25 seconds. And a 2 pound loaf is 3 hours, 4 minutes, and 25 seconds. So you can see it increased by 5 minutes each time. And then the medium crust and the dark crust, they all have the exact same working times. So on the KBS machine, it did not increase the time. The next thing it does in the cycle is it stirs it or kneads it or mixes it together. And with the sweet bread, it will mix the first time for 6 minutes. That means your paddle will begin to work and it will mix for 6 minutes. And then it will rest for 1 minute. That is only different from the soft bread function in a matter of 1 minute. The soft bread function, it will stir and mix for 7 minutes, and in the sweet bread, it mixes for 6 minutes. And then it'll rest for 1 minute, and then it will stir again, and this time for 24 minutes. And then it will let the bread rise for 50 minutes. As opposed to the soft bread function, the number one soft bread function, where it will rise for 58 minutes. So it's got a shorter rising time, and that's important to know. After that, it will the beater will come on again for 25 seconds and knock the dough down. And it's called shape. It's called the shape. And then it will ferment or rise again for 45 minutes, which is 5 minutes less than the number one function, the soft bread function. And then it's going to bake based on the size of the loaf, either for 48 minutes for a 1 pound loaf, 53 minutes for a 1.5 pound loaf, and 58 minutes for a 2 pound loaf. And those baking times are all the same no matter what color of crust you choose. So the difference in the sweetbread and the soft bread, it's shorter. So there is a shorter rising time and a longer baking time. So when would it be appropriate to use the sweetbread function as opposed to the soft bread function? And I think number one, if you live in a very humid environment or climate, or if your house is just very humid, or maybe your house is very warm, maybe you live in a very warm climate and the temperature in your house is very warm, or you're at a high altitude, I would say to use the sweetbread function because that'll give you just a little lower rising time. So because I know when it's very warm, humid, your bread will rise faster. So it could benefit you to use the sweetbread function instead of the soft bread function if you're in a very hot, humid environment. So that would be good to know. You would want to use the sweetbread function for basically any kind of bread that you know is going to rise quickly. Let's say for some reason the bread calls for an extra amount of yeast or sugar. Then you could use the sweetbread function because it's going to be more active and going to rise faster. The sweetbread function does not mean cakes. There is a function on the bread machine for cake and things like banana bread and zucchini bread and those things, but it is not the sweetbread function. This is for yeast risen bread, the sweetbread function is. It is not for cakes and breads that are made without yeast. That's basically when I think you would use the sweetbread function is anytime you need less rise time, you would use the sweetbread function. And it's only 5 minutes on one rise less, 8 minutes less rise time on the first rise, 5 minutes less rise time on the second rise. So because you don't want to let your bread over rise, or what they call overproof. If you're having trouble with your bread rising too much, or perhaps your bread is, it rises up really high and then falls, then it's overproofing. So you might want to use the sweetbread function instead. Just let me know down below if you have any questions and I'll do my very best to answer them. And if you are enjoying these videos and you find them helpful, it would be wonderful if you would hit that like button, give me a thumbs up. Subscribe to the channel if you're not subscribed and you think this is information you would like to have. I do lots of bread videos and other videos around the farm and cooking videos. I want to talk about the number 3 function on the KBS, and I don't know, you may have a function on yours machine if it's not a KBS, for sourdough. Natural sourdough is what this one is called. You would think by the name that you should be able to take your sourdough starter and make a sourdough bread totally in the bread machine. And I have a video, and I'll put the link here, for making sourdough in the bread machine, but I do not use the sourdough function. And there's actually a few steps in that process when I'm making sourdough in the bread machine. But this sourdough function that is built into the bread machine is not meant to be used without yeast. So some people just want the taste of sourdough, and they want less of the commercial yeasty flavor and more of the sour, tangy sourdough flavor. And that is when you would use the natural sourdough function, when you had a recipe that used sourdough starter, but it also used yeast. And if you look in the little recipe book that came with the KBS bread machine anyway, I have not looked at other bread machine recipe books, but feel free to look in yours and let me know. This one has a recipe for white sourdough. So this book has a recipe for making a sourdough starter, but it uses one of the starter pouches that you can buy online, and they also add active yeast into their starter. So that is not actually what I would call natural sourdough, because natural sourdough starter is made from flour and water. And I also have a video for that, and I'll put the link here so you can watch that and find out how to make your own sourdough starter from just flour and water. Then when they go to use the recipe, here it has the white sourdough bread. using the starter that you used, that they made. So you make this starter one day and you can use it the next. Well, if you've ever done sourdough, then you know that is not true sourdough, because you can't make sourdough starter in one day. But this has yeast in it. And so then when they make the bread, they use the sourdough starter that they told you to make, and they use milk and butter and honey and flour and salt. And then they use 1.5 to 1 3/4 teaspoons of yeast. So for a 2-pound loaf, they're using 1 3/4 teaspoons of yeast. So that's less yeast. That's about 1/2 teaspoon less of yeast than a regular bread recipe would use. So what you're really getting out of this is the sourdough taste, not actual sourdough. But that is what the function in the bread machine is made for. It is made for perhaps a slower rise bread, a bread that you want more gluten to develop. Let's go over what the sourdough cycle actually does. So a 1-pound loaf of sourdough bread, the total working time is 6 hours and 34 minutes. 1.5 pounds is 6 hours and 44 minutes. 2 pounds is 6 hours and 49 minutes. Once again, it's a 5-minute difference between each of the loaf sizes, and those times are the same whether it's light, medium, or dark crust. So what it does on the sourdough function is it will mix for 10 minutes. So you put all your ingredients in there, it'll mix for 10 minutes, which is several minutes longer than the other functions. And then here is a key thing with the sourdough. It will rest for 10 minutes, whereas the white bread and the sweet bread only rest for 1 minute. This one will rest for 10 minutes. And then it will stir or mix again for 22 minutes, which is a shorter time than the others, the function 1 and function 2. And then here's a big difference. It will rise for 1 hour and 30 minutes. It's going to let the bread rise for 1 hour and 30 minutes. And then it is actually going to rise again. So it doesn't do a knockdown or anything, and it will rise again for 1 hour. So that's a total of 2 hours and 30 minutes that it's going to let the dough rise. Then it's going to shape, and it will actually run for 35 seconds, so 10 seconds longer than it did on the others. And then it's going to rise again for 2 hours and 30 minutes and 25 seconds. So you're looking at a total of 5 hours of rise time in the sourdough function. And then it's going to bake a 1/2 pound loaf for 50 minutes, a 1.5 pound loaf for 1 hour, and a 2 pound loaf for 1 hour and 5 minutes. Now, if you have a sourdough recipe that can do all of its rising in 5 hours, then you may be able to use this sourdough function on your bread machine. But just keep in mind that the machine had in mind that you're going to be using a recipe that actually uses active yeast as well as a sourdough starter. So that's what the sourdough function does on at least the KBS bread machine. I may try using my sourdough starter with a little yeast and see what happens, because that may be a way to get a really good sourdough bread. I'm not against using yeast. If you're totally against using regular yeast, then that would not be the function for you, but I'm not against adding a little active yeast to my sourdough and still get that sourdough flavor. And it may be a much sweeter sourdough because the overnight one, of course, is fermented overnight, and you're going to get the more tangy sour sourdough. So that wraps it up for function 2 and 3 on the KBS bread machine. And we are going to continue this series and go through all of the functions. And I hope you find it useful. And leave me any questions that you have down below, and I'll do my best to answer them. Thanks for joining. God bless. Bye-bye.